Hello, this is Sylvia from Manchester Libraries, and I really love detective stories. So I'm here today to tell you about one series of stories and books that I really enjoy. They are the Sherlock Holmes stories. Now, if you haven't read any of them, but you have seen the adaptations, I can highly recommend them. I know that some of the stories are not what we would call now politically correct. And I also know that Arthur Conan Doyle became very interested in fairies towards the end of his life. However, he created Sherlock Holmes. And even if you haven't read any of the stories, you are aware of the character. You have an idea of what he does. He's a detective. He solves crime. And for me, reading these stories is like putting on a really woolly, cozy blanket. It's familiar, they're well written, I've read them a lot of times, and you can still find something new, some word you didn't know, or discover that actually the story that you thought was really boring isn't that terrible. He created, with Holmes, a character that is an archetype, the archetype of the detective. Most people are familiar with that, and I think as an author, it's a great thing to have achieved. I know that he wrote Holmes stories for most of his life, that he was suffering from the fame of having created Holmes and Watson, and that he wanted to stop writing more stories and focus on other things, but the public would not let him. And in a way, I am grateful for that public, because it meant that Conan Doyle created over 100 Sherlock Holmes stories, all of which are here for us to enjoy. So, all of those stories are available on BorrowBox. So if you want to give them a go, your library service gives you access to those stories as both ebooks and audiobooks. So I know this is a CD box set, and it makes me probably quite old-fashioned, but this collection of readings is actually great. It's done by Derek Jacobi, who is an incredible actor, and he reads these stories really well. On BorrowBox, you can find the rest of the collection, and I can just really recommend them. To give you a little bit of a flavour, I will now read you the start of one of the stories in this particular collection, called The Musgrave Ritual. I know that I am not Derek Jacobi, but I hope that you will bear with me and get an idea of the kind of writing that Arthur Conan Doyle did at this time. And I'm hoping that I could entice you to give the old traditional Sherlock Holmes a go, if you're familiar with the adaptations or the reimaginations that have come out in the last few years. Okay, here we go. The Musgrave Ritual. An anomaly which often struck me in the character of my friend Sherlock Holmes was that, although in his method of thought he was the neatest and most methodical of mankind, and although he affected a certain quiet primness of dress, he was nonetheless, in his personal habits, one of the most untidy men that ever drove a fellow lodger to distraction. Not that I am myself the least conventional in that respect. The rough and tumble work in Afghanistan, coming on top of a natural bohemian disposition, has made me rather more lax than befits a medical man. But with me there is a limit, and when I find a man who keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle, his tobacco in the toe end of a Persian slipper, and his unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the very centre of his wooden mantelpiece, then I begin to give myself virtuous airs. I have always held, too, that pistol practice should be distinctly an open-air pastime, and when Holmes, in one of his queer humours, would sit in an armchair with his hair trigger and 100 boxer cartridges and proceed to adorn the opposite wall with a patriotic VR, done in bullet pox, I felt strongly that neither the atmosphere nor the appearance of the room was improved by it. Our chambers were always full of chemicals and criminal relics, which had a way of wandering into unlikely positions and turning up in the butter dish or even less desirable places. But his papers were my great crux. He had a horror of destroying documents, especially those which were connected to his past cases, and yet it was only once in every year or two that he would muster the energy to docket and arrange them, for, as I have mentioned previously somewhere in these incoherent memoirs, the outbursts of passionate energy when he performed the remarkable feats with which his name is associated were followed by reactions of lethargy, during which he would lie about with his violin and his books, hardly moving save from the sofa to the table. Thus, month after month, his papers accumulated, until every corner of the room was stacked with bundles of manuscript which were on no account to be burned, and which could not be put away save by their owner. One winter's night, as we sat together by the fire, I ventured to suggest to him that, as he had finished pasting extracts into his commonplace book, he might employ the next 2 hours making our room a little more habitable. He could not deny the justice of my request, so with a rather rueful face, he went off to his bedroom, from which he returned presently, pulling a large tin box behind him. This he placed in the middle of the floor, and, squatting down upon a stool in front of it, he threw back the lid. I could see that it was already a third full of bundles of papers tied up with red tape into separate packages. "There are cases enough here, Watson," said he, looking at me with mischievous eyes. "I think that if you knew all that I had in this box, you would ask me to pull some out instead of putting others in." "These are the records of your early work, then?" I asked. "I have often wished that I had notes to those cases." "Yes, my boy. These are all done prematurely, before my biographer came along to glorify me." He lifted bundle after bundle in a tender, caressing sort of way. "They are not all successes, Watson," said he, "but there are some pretty little problems among them. Here's the record of the Tarleton murders, and the case of the Vanbury, the wine merchant, and the adventure of the old Russian woman, and the singular affair of the aluminium crutch, as well as a full account of Ricoletti and the club foot, and his abominable wife. And here, now, this really is something a little recherché." So, if you want to find out what Holmes calls a little recherché, give the Musgrave Ritual a whirl and see if you can find any of them on BorrowBox. And yes, so hopefully you enjoyed my little journey into the world of Arthur Conan Doyle. I will come back to you with more detective stories, and I hope to see you soon. So if you've liked this video, please like and subscribe, and let us know what you're reading. Okay, bye!